Thank you very much, Johnny. Can everyone hear me okay? It's good. Thank you. So this is like a preface to the discussion that I hope we'll have. So first of all, AI may be considered on multiple levels, most prominently through a technological lens, where it is leading to new products and services that are shaping institutions, politics, society, and ourselves. However, AI is at its core a philosophical program, even theological, which is being advanced by the methods of modern technoscience with an implicit philosophy and instrumentalized by engineers. This represents the scientific reclamation of the most ancient questions in... Play that video, sorry. The scientific reclamation of the most ancient questions in philosophy and theology on the nature of mind, thought, cognition, autonomy, and agency and action. AI is also becoming vital to scientific advancement itself, since in an increasing number of disciplines, the key challenges are that the problems... sorry, having some video difficulty. This should be playing in the back. If this one could be played, and yeah, thank you. So, AI is also becoming vital to scientific advancement. The volume muted on these two videos, please. AI is also becoming vital to scientific advancement itself, since in an increasing number of disciplines, the key challenges are that the problems have become too complex to handle by traditional computational simulations. Hence, AI techniques alongside machine learning, the rise of high-performance computing and vast quantities of data are expanding the vision of scientists to a new universe of complexity. And with this new instrument of science, AI is fundamentally altering methodologies across virtually every scientific discipline and presents nothing less than a Galilean revolution. This leads to serious epistemological questions, which are especially problematic when it comes to the application or misapplication of AI in the social sciences and humanities, or even worse, the use of AI for psychographic profiling by corporations, or even worse still, to entrench the power of authoritarian regimes. Leaked documents regarding Chinese re-education centers say that the aim of these detention camps is to build new, better Chinese citizens. First, we must break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. However, new technologies centered around AI are able to turn entire countries into detention camps through algorithmic control. I argue that similar processes...
Away from judging people based on their resumes and skills,
volume up, please.
decisions based on people's personality.
Similar processes are
This
operative
company,
in the West.
DeepSense, uses applicants' Twitter, LinkedIn, and other social media accounts to do more than just check for questionable behavior. DeepSense says that it runs scientifically based tests to surface people's
So I argue that similar processes are operative in the West. For example, the same tools are altering the workplace as an increasing number, as we saw in the previous clip, as an increasing number of firms are under pressure to compete for the most productive employees and to push their workers to achieve maximum output. So if you think of this clip in connection with the one that was previously on there, so play this clip, please.
Head up, Michael. Don't slouch. Just as I thought. Extremely stubborn and suspicious.
I am not.
See for yourself.
Extremely stubborn and
Suspicious. Now you, Jane. Rather inclined to giggle doesn't put things away.
How about you?
Very well. Hold this for me. As I expected, Mary Poppins practically perfect in every way.
The point here is that it's not only authoritarian regimes that are venerating the algorithmic gaze and AI as a magical tool for a new form of digital physiognomy. Furthermore, the next frontiers for capitalist expansion are cyberspace and augmented reality by one-to-one mapping of the world covering everything, which will lead to the creation of a new commercially controlled realm that is not only coexistent with the material world, but increasingly envelops. A key word here from industrial robotics, physical space, by bringing hundreds of billions of edge devices such as smartphones, autonomous vehicles, drones, and robots, as well as artificial and human agents, into ontological contiguity as informational entities embedded in a new informational environment, which is the ambition of fields such as cyber-physical systems. A recent paper by Caldry and Magias says that if successful, this transformation will leave no discernible outside to capitalist production. Everyday life will have become directly incorporated into the capitalist process of production. The philosophical implications of the intersection of humans and machines in the shared space of the infosphere entails what Luciano Floridi has described as a re-ontologization of our environment and of ourselves. In this view, we are becoming informational entities alongside other informational entities as part of a vast information processing system, such that we become interchangeable with algorithmic agents with autonomous instrumental rationality. According to Floridi, future generations will cease to appreciate any ontological difference between artificial agents and themselves, or even the mediated reality of the infosphere and the physical world. The idea is not new. As an example, over 2 decades ago, Maslach's book titled The Forced Discontinuity described how the momentum of technological progress in that era during the last wave of AI research was leading towards ontological continuity between humans and machines. Recently, Frischman and Selinger published a book titled Re-Engineering Humanity, describing how we have become embedded in programmatic systems that force us to behave like machines. Hence, mechanomorphization is in its final stages, since in recent years we have all become aware of the aggressive shaping of consumer electoral preferences by AI-based dynamic programmatic advertising in consumptive activities and in politics. The technological environment is now structured to place humans in a cybernetic feedback loop where thought is eliminated from consumption to short-circuit the process of reflection that stands between one's recognition of a desire and its fulfillment via the market, according to Greenfield. What I argue is that that ethical and moral reflection are similarly being short-circuited in the process of production in work. A stark illustration of what it means to be an infog is to be found in the phenomenon of so-called micro-workers, who are being used as artificial intelligence for human intelligence tasks that have been divorced from any form of reflection and which are to be fully automated and eventually taken over by artificial agents. Here, the deeply metaphysical research program underlying AI research becomes apparent, with the aim to place humankind in the position of being divine maker of the world, the demiurge, while at the same time condemning human beings to see themselves as out of date. Religions have taught us to be concerned about the condition and destiny of our souls in the metaphorical hands of God. In the future, we'll be concerned with the condition of our informational selves in the silicon grip of a new pantheon of demigods behind the clouds. So, as you all are nudged and pushed around to different recommendations of speakers and so on, I ask you to reflect on whose grip you are being held in and to whom your heads are being made to bow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jakob. They say that artificial intelligence is easy and AV is hard, so I appreciate that he stuck with the challenges, and I know the team is working hard to keep everything on track as well. Our next speaker, I'm very excited to welcome to the stage, is Dr. Elena Antonova, who is a lecturer in psychology at King's College London and a Mind Life Fellow at the Mind Life Institute. Elena is interested in studying the neuroscience of wellness. And since AI is so commonly held up as sort of an antidote to our current, the anxieties of our current age, I'm very excited to hear her perspective on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. So what I have to say is really relevant to the context of humanoid robotics, so building androids, our artificial life companions. And the question is how we're going to treat them and how they're going to treat us. Those are two basic components of ethics that we have amongst ourselves and towards other sentient beings, such as animals, and we extend those to the artificial agents. And we're already seeing today two directions developing in parallel, catering to our basic needs. We have Harmony, the first sex robot built in the US. You know, she's submissive, she will cater to your sexual desires, she can support a conversation, you know, a dirty conversation, but she can also talk to you about Heidegger if you so wish. And maybe eventually, you know, finish off with a toilet humor joke. So the conversational abilities of those androids or robots are becoming more and more impressive. Here on the right, you see Android Canon is the Zen Buddhism counterpart of Avalokiteshvara, deity of compassion and deity of compassion and mercy. And she's reciting the Heart Sutra in the Kodachi Temple in Kyoto. And the sutra, the content of the sutra, the intention of the sutra is the compassion and loving kindness toward all sentient beings. So it's a completely different symbolism we see here with Android Canon. So both of those examples of androids that are pretty much programmed in. So the software and hardware engineer is still the god that creates its creature, and the creature is very limited to what's being inputted into it by the god. But we're also seeing a very rapid development of open-ended algorithms. And on the right here is the capture of the YouTube video of the algorithm Poet that was released by Uber AI Lab at the beginning of this year. It creates its own environment, and it also provides by itself solutions to the ever-increasing, ever-complex, ever-more diverse environmental challenges. So we're still at the level of computer games here, but the intention behind those open-ended algorithms is to emulate the creativity of nature, its unbound, infinite ability to create diversity. And of course, we know in nature, this creativity follows a normal distribution of the traits from psychopathic to compassionate and altruist. So although we do not want to control the development of AI, I think we reached the point where we need to very much stir it in a direction where we don't create an AI Armageddon that some of us find impressioned by with various Hollywood and scenarios fed to our imagination. So this is a sort of snapshot of the paper that I presented in Tokyo at Artificial Life or ALife conference last year in collaboration with Professor Nihanif, who you could see on the left there interacting with his creation or his lab's creation, a very cute iCub Dichi. Dichi is programmed to learn language as a child would do from the interactions, and it actually achieves a no mean feat, learning negations, which actually, if you talk to linguists, is not an easy thing to learn. It's not programmed in, it's only programmed to interact and learn from experience. So we're starting to hit upon technologies that lead to the new skill learning that is not there programmed from the start. And there is a huge drive, a huge fashion building in modules or self-processes into humanoid robots, trying to emulate human-like qualities in the attempt to create human-like intelligence, human-like cognition, particularly for social AI. And we're having an introduction of temporal horizons, what we call narrative self, autobiographical self, upon which the social self builds itself. Those processes instantiated in the brain in an extremely complex way, but one of the networks that is associated with self-related processes is so-called default mode network. And what we know about it from the study of psychopathologies is that this network is hyperactive in pretty much every psychopathology under the sun, or in DSM-5. But I don't know why it keeps on going to the next slide without my invitation. And this network is attenuated during mindfulness practices, which is my specialism, neuroscience of mindfulness meditation. So we already know quite a bit about healthy self-related processes versus the ones that can lead to psychopathological manifestations. But from what I'm seeing in AI development today, that knowledge is not being utilized whatsoever, not just a little bit. So my sort of proposition at ALife conference and here is that we have to start drawing from what we know from developmental psychology, from clinical psychology and neuroscience, and from contemplative neuroscience in order to start mitigating against sort of AI risks early on and ethically developing, our ANCABs, our artificial offsprings, with the same care as we grow our children. My sort of invitation for the future is to start to think outside of the usual emphasis on artificial intelligence or human intelligence as something that sustains our rational, logical thought, and try to tap into things like imagination, intuition, and insight, not only to develop artificial life that has capabilities way beyond what the rational thought can offer, but also in an attempt to understand ourselves better. And the future is very much now. And which wolf we choose to feed, we have to be thinking about it every step of the way. Which one we choose to feed intellectually and collectively, and which pill we choose to swallow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. So we've heard now a bit about the kind of complexities about how artificial intelligence is changing our sense of self. And we're now going to hear from Stephanie Dick, who's a professor at University of Pennsylvania in the History and Sociology of Science Department, about some of the authority involved in artificial intelligence and in mathematics more generally. Steph was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows before getting tenure in Pennsylvania, and is going to talk to us about the automation of proof. Steph. Sort of.
Thank you. I'm very cold. I hope you're all a bit warmer than I am. I've been insisting that I'm not cold for the last 2 days, but I'm cold now. But I'm having a really good time also being here, and thank you for being here too. So I'm a historian, probably not the most natural choice to talk about bold futures, but historians are consistently insisting that if we do not take on board the insights of our historical inquiry, when we imagine and then design the futures that we're after, we'll be in trouble. And I want to share one particular story that I think might help illuminate how that is true. So in particular, I'm a historian of efforts to automate mathematical reasoning, mathematical theorem proving, and mathematical problem solving in the second half of the 20th century. And it's a really interesting field to study because it turns out to have a lot more to do with what kinds of people we are meant to be than it does with what computers are able to do. The people I study debate a lot. What is the character of human mathematical faculties like reasoning and intuition and understanding? And can or how might some of those cognitive faculties be automated, if at all? And there's a lot of disagreement about those tasks. And time and again, historians have demonstrated or insisted that computers very rarely actually replace people at doing any particular task, but that automation efforts consistently involve a rethinking, a reimagining, a transformation of the task that has the machine and its affordances and limitations and possibilities in mind. But the machine, of course, has also always been perceived very differently. The possible contributions it might be able to make to different domains are seen differently by particular communities. And this was true for the people that I study as well. Just to give you a sense, this is a smattering of some of the always provocative, almost always anthropomorphic language that the people I studied used to try to imagine what kind of thing the computer was, how much like a person it might be, what kinds of cognitive labor it might be able to take on. So at one end of that spectrum were those people who imagined that, at least in principle, the computer would be able to do everything that a human mathematician did, that all of the relevant cognitive faculties from intuition to reasoning could, at least in principle, be rendered as a set of rules that could therefore be automated, and that computers would one day become like colleagues or mentors or coworkers. Some less optimistic people imagined instead that the computer would be more like a graduate student or a high school student or an apprentice. It would be able to take on some cognitive work, it would be able to make some kinds of contributions, but not without expert human guidance, always checking and guiding the paths that the automation would take. And at the other end of the spectrum were those who believed that computers would only ever be able to take on the merely mechanical and menial components of human cognitive labor, and that they would come to play the role of a servant or a slave or an assistant to the mathematician with her uniquely human faculties that would never be automatable. And each of these different visions has built into it a set of assumptions about what goes into the work that human mathematicians do, and a partitioning of that labor into what might be automated and what might belong to the machine. And in that sense, artificial intelligence today and in this moment in the 1960s participates in a much longer history of human cognitive labor and physical labor. And one of my favorite examples to illustrate this comes from a historian named Lorraine Daston, who writes about the history of mathematics. And she points out that in the 18th century, calculation, the ability to sort of solve complex equations elegantly or efficiently, was literally associated with mathematical genius. That was the domain of French philosophers and German mathematicians. It required real presence of mind, attention to detail, cognitive depth. And by the 19th century, in part through the application of Adam Smith's principles for the division of labor to the work of solving mathematical equations, calculation had been stripped of its association with genius and had been relegated to the realm of the merely mechanical. And it is also in that moment when arithmetic, calculation, is reduced to the merely mechanical that it becomes women's labor, and it becomes the domain of low-paid, unskilled laborers who become the human computers that perform the tasks that we now have machines performing for us everywhere. Most of you probably know the word computer actually referred to a person for most of its history. And new faculties become associated with human genius and human ingenuity. And so the way we automate and partition different cognitive tasks participates in this much longer history of valuing and devaluing certain forms of labor and certain forms of cognition, and with them, the people and machines who execute them. And so looking forward, our question should not just be what powerful tasks can we build systems to accomplish, but also whose value or whose labor, what forms of labor are being valued and devalued in that context. And for one, I find it striking that certain tasks that human beings are quite good at and also love to do, like recommending books, recommending music, political organization, are increasingly subjected to algorithmic processes, where other tasks like stocking boxes on shelves are being increasingly done by people who are themselves increasingly disciplined. We are best able to automate tasks that we have forced people to do in a disciplined way in advance. And those are questions I think we should have in mind when we imagine our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steph. The final panelist before we turn over to Q&A here is Sean McDonald, who is co-founder of the organization called Digital Public, and he is a lawyer and CEO also of Frontline SMS, as well as a fellow of the Duke Center of Law and Technology and a fellow of the Center for Internet Governance and Innovation. He's also the man who coined the term data trust. So please welcome Sean.
Good afternoon. I have a bunch of weather-related quips, but I will spare you. So if what we're talking about, or if what the panelists to now have been talking about, is sort of the disaggregation of human cognition, my role, or the things that I focus on, tend to be much more about the governance of, or the comparative prioritization of the way that we use data, or the way that we apply artificial intelligence. So I am predominantly interested in the kind of political economy, for lack of a more interesting term. And if you think about sort of where does governance come from, a lot of what we end up doing, at least in political science, and then a number of its sort of applied disciplines, is it's reverse engineering the world as we find it. And so much of what we're trying to do, I think, as a community and as a group of professionals is ensure that we're doing so intentionally going forward, that the individual functions of artificial intelligence aggregate to things that reflect our values in the societies that we want to live in. So my work kind of breaks into two, I've apparently 4 jobs, but breaks into essentially 2 main categories. And the first is looking at what are the comparative public institutional frameworks that we might use. So who gets representation at the table for how we make decisions about data governance and artificial intelligence governance? And in particular, looking at what are the validation standards that we use? How do we know that not only is something achieving whatever its sort of promise is, but that it is also not substantially rebalancing the equation? And then also similarly kind of with use. A lot of times things that seem very obvious in terms of how data that we should have, that should be collected, that should be applied and considered, the quality of those observations changes dramatically from one use case to the other. So a popular example of this is biometric data. There are a number of use cases, sometimes even controversially, but where biometric data makes a ton of sense. There are also places where, so one example of that is, for example, providing services to refugees. The World Food Program uses an enormous amount of biometric data to target and make the most of the limited resources that it has to respond to disaster. However, the World Food Program also has a number of obligations to political parties or to governments in political contexts. And so the potential reuse of that same data collected under those same circumstances raises a significant number of governance challenges. And what we find is that those governance challenges are moving to the corners of authority. They're getting harder and harder to enforce in our traditional contexts and institutional infrastructures. Can you all see the steam coming out of my mouth as I'm talking? Am I imagining that? It's not my breath, I promise. The second sort of main category of things that I do is look at what private data governance looks like. We can't have a particularly usable conversation about data governance without figuring out kind of where the membrane between public authority and private work is. And so I look quite a bit at supply chains. My background is also in law. And so there's a whole lot around how we design the contracting infrastructure and the sort of legal foundations of the way that we build artificial intelligence, the way that we collect and use sensitive data, to ensure that as organizations or companies unbundle or move into component parts, that we're able to ensure that our values or the promises originally made to us are able to be kept. And and so the primary vehicle for that has been my work on, has been work on data trusts. So for those of you who don't know, trusts are a legal contractual form that essentially appoints a fiduciary or a person who's legally accountable to you to broker things on your behalf, to protect your best interests in the way that complex systems work. So there are kind of 4 main benefits that I think of in terms of using trusts. One is that they provide a vehicle for very clear accountability. And I think that when we're talking about how it is that we assure or invoke the trust of the public, remaining accountable in some articulable way, some accessible way, is extraordinarily important. The second is that trusts are volitional, which is to say you enter into them voluntarily. And by virtue of that, you also are significantly more explicit about what your purposes and your responsibilities are. And so whereas now the kind of status quo of a lot of data contracting can be pretty open-ended, trusts tend to be pretty focused. They are also extraordinarily granular, which is to say that they force a certain amount of, in creating a trust, one has to think about not only the positives and the values, but potentially the threats and the negatives. So not only how you pursue the best of what you intend to build, but how do you prevent bad action or bad reaction with the things that you build. And that kind of granularity, alongside sort of volitional contracting, ends up bringing a much clearer articulation of what a data relationship or a relationship with an artificial intelligence or agent might look like. And finally, and this loops back to accountability, it is fiduciary. And it is also where fiduciary means someone who is legally accountable, usually for loyalty and also for care. And those duties are ways that we access enforcement infrastructure. So we can bring someone to court who is a fiduciary for us for not representing those duties. Fiduciary duties in law often function the way sort of objective functions work in artificial intelligence, which is to say they post a goal and that all of the activity around that goal is evaluated through that prism. And so fiduciaries tend to be single interest, right? Your doctor is generally speaking a fiduciary to you. Your lawyer may be a fiduciary, should be a fiduciary to you. Your insurance broker may be. But the idea is that individual functions are no longer particularly sufficient. And so even in law, the idea of a fiduciary is going toward governance. It is this idea that we will have to balance lots of single function or limited design tools, whether those are automations or AIs or products of law, and we'll have to balance them in a way that serves a commonly held set of values that extends beyond the fiduciary relationship. So trusts are a way that we can also flexibly start designing those governance tools and experimenting with what works and what might not work. I think most of the rest of the most interesting things that are going to be said are going to be in the conversation. So I'll just end there.
Thank you very much, Sean. So we are going to open the floor to questions, but first I'm going to, if this works, does this work? No? Great, okay. I'm going to come and join you guys over here. And just anecdotally, when the term artificial intelligence was coined in 1955, the man who coined it was toying with a couple other names, and one of the names was applied epistemology. Who knows what the term epistemology means? You don't have to put your hands up. Nobody knows what it means. Jakob, how would you define epistemology?
I mean, the epistemological questions are how do we know what we know, and the nature of knowledge itself. So, I mean, there are very deep questions about machine epistemology which need to be addressed, and the limitations of what we can actually know through machines, and the nature of our epistemic contact with the world, and the nature of how machines make epistemic contact with the world. I mean, essentially. I would say that many of the ethical problems occur at this disjuncture between understanding the environment, the data environment that an artificial agent sort of inhabits, which is, I mean, essentially it's a mathematical construction, so its sort of life world, Umwelt, is very different from our life world, and so understanding that is like as I say, the epistemic contact. The difference in epistemic contact between humans and the world and machines and the world is an important area. Yeah.
So the thing I'm kind of driving towards, I'd be curious for all of your thoughts on, but Ellen, I want to start with you, is it seems like what we're talking about here is as the definition, or as we rethink about what constitutes a mind in the world today, we privilege machines to do some of the work that humans used to do. We have to rethink about who's accountable when things go wrong. It seems like there's, a scientific strain asking those questions, and then about authority, and then there's strong industrial actors pitching their idea of what is true. And Jürgen Katz at Harvard has written about the, artificial intelligence, the field versus artificial intelligence revolution, the kind of marketing construct. What do you think of as cognition? How would you separate cognition in a machine versus the sort of work you do in neuroscience and human cognition? In a nutshell.
Well, we of course model traditionally cognition in humans very much by how artificial intelligence progressed. The functionalist models of the mind, they very much evolved out of computer science that started grappling with the problems of intelligence in the AI context. But we're very much moving away from the functionalist models of the mind and functionalist models of the brain, and starting to get more interested in experience rather than cognitive functions, experience of various things that the mind has capacity to not just to comprehend, but to sense, to get hold of. And another question is how do we relate to these experiences? So we're starting to re-investigate the dynamics of the brain, at least in the field that I'm involved in. What are dynamic of experience? And there's this emerging field of neuroscience of psychedelics, and we're starting to touch on things
Sean's
like...
actually on acid right now.
He's always on acid from what I hear. But, well, actually, from tomorrow, I'm running this workshop for Mind and Life Europe, where we're looking at the similarities and differences between meditation, psychedelics, shamanic trust, hypnosis. So we're very much expanding the range of experiential possibilities that neuroscience is interested in studying. So we're no longer bound by executive function, attention, working memory. Those are very limiting concepts when we're trying to understand human mind, right? And particularly in my field, when you're trying to understand very subtle experiences of deep meditation, working memory, executive function just simply do not apply, and we haven't developed a language yet to talk about those things. So if we really try to build artificial life that emulates human mind, we have to start understanding those more kind of non-ordinary experiential states.
Thank you. So the part of the reason I ask is you know, people who are kind of researching the singularity or the idea that we are within reach of artificial general intelligence speculate sometimes on how we will relate to the machines. And I've wondered in the past if we were to reach artificial general intelligence or past that, something that was conscious, that we would, you know, label as conscious, if it didn't die, how much could we really understand it? Because, you know, if death is so long as death is promised to our species, something that doesn't die it'll be a very different value system how it lives. I'm going to put a peg in that, though, just for a moment, because I think that as these experiments happen, Steph, I want to ask you about the distribution of labor becomes very important, because as you've noted, there's winners and losers in terms of how the labor is changed, not so much which labor disappears, but how labor is, you know, put to some groups versus others. My question is, looking into the future, which parts of, you know, human labor do you think will be increasingly devalued? Or which groups do you think currently are suffering because of this redistribution of labor?
Yeah, I mean, there's an obvious trend in the early history of artificial intelligence when there's a lot of oversold enthusiasm about what automated systems might be able to do, where, I can probably build an algorithm that will be able to simulate the process of medical diagnosis, or I will probably be able to develop a system that can play chess. And actors who have a lot of existent academic capital can say, no, you can't. The doctors say, actually, diagnosis is a craft. It is not formalizable. It is not rule-bound. It can't be automated. And their perception of their own expertise is given a lot of credit in those early debates, where factory workers or lower-paid skilled workers, when they claim they have an unautomatable skill, there's less value placed in that assessment of their own sort of capabilities. But increasingly, I'm convinced that what we should be looking for or watching for is less where people are being replaced and more for the new ways that human laborers are being disciplined. So one of my favorite scholars on this point is a woman named Karen Levy, who writes about the automation of truck driving, which is a huge area of automated research. In the 2016 White House report on artificial intelligence in the economy, they predicted that it would be trucking that might be most affected in terms of job loss by automation. But there are still millions of truck drivers, but they are increasingly cohabitating with all kinds of surveilling and disciplining instruments. So technologies that monitor their pulse, their eyelid movements, their pressure on the gas pedal, and this job one used to do to embody a certain kind of American masculinity, to be on the road, to have freedom, they narrate this change as a loss of agency, a loss of freedom. They're increasingly sort of disciplined by this new host of surveillance technologies. And so I think it's as interesting and important a question to ask, sort of where are people being monitored and their bodies disciplined in new ways, as much as where they are being replaced, if anywhere, in that simple kind of way.
And wellness is kind of an indicator of this, isn't it? Because wellness is slotted into our lives now, that like you should be able to bear any number of hours work so long as you have a wellness program that is mitigating the excesses. It's just kind of algorithmically plugged in. Sean, you'd said to me last night that you think the way that companies are dealing with wellness is similar to how they deal with data governance. What did you mean by that? Do you remember that conversation?
I'm like really struggling to keep it together, you understand? There's all this acid in my system. No,
I took it too, so we.
Oh, cool.
Hasn't kicked in yet.
This went stop fast. No, I mean, I think that basically it's about managing the role that we play against each other or around each other and placing reasonable bounds on it. I don't, it's not a wellness in and of itself is super difficult to measure, and it's not really clear whether or not, as long as someone is comfortable, we should stop them from working in the same way that, we don't have a great set of indicators for how we treat an automation or what we automate. So I think that there's not, it is basically a sort of holistic control of environment set of questions, and then it is how do you apply it to different models of behavior in that space. And so I think that where you are introducing AI into places where there are also very quantified wellness programs, you start to look at what are the managerial and therefore the sort of executive authority roles that are, that are acquired by that AI, and then what is the basis of that authority? And I think that one of the things that's really fascinating, and I think that this is where it's slotted into the conversation, is that a lot of times when we talk about law, we talk about it as how do we pass it, or how do we elect a person to be valid, or how do we ensure that the upfront grant of authority is one that we support, but what we don't always talk about are sort of how those systems work and what remedies they're actually capable of providing. So I think that automation is also in a lot of ways blending the sort of purview of a boss. You're seeing lots of organizations being held accountable for their employees' work. And I think that you'll see more and more of that in the automation space as well.
So even as we've moved away in the study of neuroscience from thinking of cognition on executive terms, we are still within a capitalist system that assigns executive function to things that might otherwise succeed or make our lives better. Did you want to respond?
I think it's that assignment of authority that lies at the root of a lot of the equity and kind of governance challenges that we have.
Right, and authority that historically we have reason to question, is what I take from your talk as well, Steph. Okay, so before we open the floor to questions from you guys, Jakob, I wanted to return to you, and I'll to you, but Jakob first, about how our environment is changing. We hear a lot about artificial or augmented reality and virtual reality. What do you anticipate the challenges will be? So, given we're on the ethics stage here, what do you think the worries we should have are about those technologies? I love that you're wearing the parka from that Bruce Willis movie, too, by the way.
Sorry, I'm just absolutely freezing cold.
We all are, don't worry. Keep going.
So, yes, so I use that phrase which Luciano Floridi raises, which is the re-ontologization of ourselves and our environment. And then, I showed that, the hand at the end, with attached to the marionette doll. So, if you think about sort of the environment which we're currently in, the digital infrastructure which is invisible to us, for example, the 5G networks, which, all of these telecommunication networks, they decrease latency in the bi-directional communication between us and, the servers and the background infrastructure. So you can imagine that the strings of the marionette doll are sort of like, if they have some slack in them, then there's like a lag between the control of the limbs or the head or the eyes and so on. And each of those strings is sort of attached to a different finger as well. So what I see is that there's a competition in terms of amongst different corporations in terms of gaining control over each of those fingers on the hand in the end. And also that the string is being pulled tighter with the decreasing latency of the communication networks. And this sort of, it sort of embeds us in a system of control and disciplining, which is, I think, very, very problematic. And I think, is this getting to, yeah.
Well, can I respond to that quickly?
Yeah, go.
Because your provocation at the end of your talk was, even at this event, all of us had to sign in with an app that might know where we are for the rest of the day or the rest of the week or the rest of the year if we don't delete that app.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, subtle parts of our daily life are increasingly kind of chopped up, measured, and presumably, open to control. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, basically, if you're familiar with the work of Deleuze and Guattari, so Deleuze talks about societies of control, where we've become individuals. So that great infographic from Kate Crawford showing all of the different biometric data, physiological data, psychographic data. That's sort of, we've become, as Deleuze says, individuals. And basically this affects a sort of state of modulation and control in all of our activities, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in educational context, whether it's in academia, but throughout society. And I mean, if I had more time to discuss, I would sort of explain why the sort of computational infrastructure which we have today, which gave rise to AI. I mean, it's by virtue of the graphical processing units which affected sort of orders of magnitude speed up in certain computations. Now, it seems slightly unlikely that in the sort of maybe 10 to 20-year horizon that there would be some as a significant revolution in computational architecture to provide orders of magnitude speed up in computation performance. So what we're really seeing is sort of the scale up of the type of computation that we have available to us now, and then we could sort of work out alongside the roadmaps which corporations are, propose and their activities, how things will sort of develop into the future. And I mean, as I say, I think the sort of dystopian elements are quite worrying. So if you can look at, as I say, the Chinese system of algorithmic control is also being, spread out into the Western system as well. So
yeah, well, that's an interesting question historically, because in the West, we are quick to demonize the Chinese social credit system, and it has its, there's plenty to be critical of. But here we accept, credit systems that are increasingly as, if not more, sophisticated in profiling individuals. And I've heard before, this will be the final question before I hand over the mic to the audience, but Elena, we've now talked about kind of reconceptualizations legally about collective obligations to one another. We've talked about how we understand each other. But in your work in mindfulness, how does this begin at the core? How do you find, given your scientific work, how should we relate to ourselves in this kind of increase in the infosphere? How do you resist these sort of excesses, and how do you find peace in this world? I'm asking you the easy questions on this panel.
Yes, in 10 seconds.
If Sean has more acid, we might be able to get you some. We're not on. Yeah, keep going.
Well, as I often joke, we just have to follow 3 basic Buddhist instructions for life free of suffering and the inner freedom, which is non-grasping, non-grasping, non-grasping. Basically, it doesn't matter what we experience, it's how we relate to it that matters. So as long as our mind is not a Velcro where everything sticks all the time, we're aware of the experiences, but we're aware of them non-reactively. So that gives a door. It's a door to sort of inner freedom, regardless of what's imposed from us from the outside. And if we all follow that road, hopefully, collectively what we aim for, the walk we pass together would also change.
So
change starts with us.
I really like that metaphor of Velcro. I had not heard that before. I have a mic here. Can we have a runner. Question from the audience. Just there, yeah. I'm not sure if that microphone is on. You might have to turn it on if it's not. It's not on? Oh, there it is. Hello. What's your name?
I'm Felix. Stephanie, I was really interested by what you were saying about the AI revolution leading to labor control and disciplining and people being turned into machines. Can you talk a bit more about that, possibly in the way that we saw a similar thing in terms of the Industrial Revolution in terms of increasing labor control and strategies?
Great, sure. I would love to. One of my favorite historical facts is that Karl Marx and Charles Babbage were living in London in the same time in the 19th century, seeing exactly the same thing on streets and in factories. And Charles Babbage is touring the country with his sort of prototype calculating machines, and Karl Marx is touring the country, sort of talking to working class people, and he attends some of these events that Babbage puts on where he was referring in anthropomorphic terms to his machine, that it's thinking, that it has memory, that it is intelligent, it is sort of doing for mental labor what factories have done for physical labor. And Karl Marx says, it's amazing to me that you are so quick to anthropomorphize your machinery, to ascribe human faculties to these cogs and gears, and simultaneously so quick to dehumanize the people working in the factories as mere cogs in a machine. And I think we are just living through another iteration of that kind of tension where the increasing discipline of certain forms of labor and laborers, the ways that they are surveilled by their employers, by their cell phones, by their apps, speaks a lot, I think, as well as we are so quick to ascribe such profound significance to what are essentially a bunch of really accurate predictions. I think it's a really similar moment to that one in the 19th century, yeah.
Sean, do you want to, actually, we'll take one more question over here, and while the mic gets to him, how do we mitigate these sort of risks? Like, how do we respond? You're a lawyer. What actions do we take? Who do we have to sue?
Everybody. No, I think that the dehumanization piece is really important. And I think that one of the things that's really fascinating about a lot of it is that we have accountability models built for humans. We have accountability models built for things that humans build. But we don't really have accountability models for systems that turn back into, we don't have great kind of pushback against this kind of creep. And so it becomes a binary. Every time you can choose to be a part of it, you can choose to work here, you can choose for this, reduction in your health insurance or what have you, but it conscripts you into a system which then becomes very difficult to escape in a longer term. And it's the ability to adapt. I mean, one of the things that's striking to me about what you were saying is quick to humanize machines and quick to dehumanize humans. We, as humans, very often recognize that our core strength is adaptability, and yet what we are constantly trying to do is offload the labor of adaptability and, lionize the present.
Okay, we got time for one last question over here.
Yeah, hello, Chad. It's so interesting that the discussion about ethics is on the edge of this conference and cast into the cold.
That's true.
They gave us blankets.
How does everything you're talking about edge a little bit closer to the center and into a little bit more of the warmth?
That's a very good question. I actually, maybe to close this out, I'm going to invite each of you, please, to reflect on that, if you would, briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the point. If you don't sort of assimilate and embrace the systems and allow yourself to be embedded, then, yeah, you are, as the boss talks about, dispossessed in your access to the systems and, the comfort and the usefulness and all of the benefits of being part of the system are, you're excluded from all of it. I would actually go further than Zuboff and say it's rather a disinheritance. Rather than more so than dispossession.
I didn't quite get the end of the question.
The question is, we've been cast out in the cold here to talk about ethics, and the other stages are inside and they're very warm. And how do we steer things? How do we steer the resistance that's kind of latent in this conversation? How do we push back and seize the warm stages?
The warm stages. Right. Well, I was told yesterday at the speakers' dinner that although we got an outdoor stage, is the stage. that we were given the best, the central stage. So it's just, English summer never fails to disappoint. But how do we push back? I guess the resistance boils down, from my perspective, to the same resistance we have within each of us towards choosing things that are really nourishing. We all seem to have, as Freud called it, a sort of a self-destructive or death wish, that there's this self-destructiveness in us, but there is another component in us that is pro-social, that is about nourishment, that is about reaching for the stars. And, as I had my sort of wolf in reference to the sort of Cherokee tale of two wolves. It's our constant choice. Every moment we choose which wolf we feed. So if we individually and collectively feed the wolf of prosociality, altruism, compassion, we will build a different world. I do find myself a bit of a preacher and sort of trying to steer away from doom and gloom, but at the end of the day, it's as simple as that, really. But we just find it very difficult to do that. within ourselves.
So we should focus on the fact that there's a bunch of people here, despite it being so cold that they've come out. Yeah.
That is impressive.
Okay.
That is impressive. So that's the hope for the future.
Steph?
I'm really worried. The reason I'm so worried is because I think a lot of forms of resistance ultimately end up being sort of eaten by the system that they seek to push against. And I think a lot of talk about what we need is to diversify tech giants. We need to regulate Facebook. We need to, take X, Y, and Z measure, actually serve to entrench the hegemony of those systems rather than push against them. And that so many forms of resistance actually just reinforce the social order that you might mean to dismantle with your labor. And there's this way, we've been talking about this for the last couple of days, there's this way that machine learning is sort of increasingly encroaching on every conversation. So we've learned that fairness is hard, that racial bias is subtle. We've learned all of these things, and the answer is, well, we need the right constraint on our prediction rule to sort of solve for that. They're made into mathematical problems. And I think it is crucially important that we insist that there are actually multiple ways to know and multiple forms of question and answer that can't necessarily be put into the terms that are being given to us by technical practitioners. And that seems like a really important sort of stand to make, especially in universities where I spend all of my time. I don't know how that translates into political work. But I think it's very important to recognize that certain things, even like regulation, which might feel so powerful, might actually reinforce the sort of power and centrality of systems, that we might actually want to consider the possibility that some things need to be like turned off, and we're sort of losing sight of that possibility, I think.
Elena's going to make a very quick comment, and Sean.
Very quick addition to it, and we need to stop pretending that we have the answers. We're really good at making assumptions and starting to trust them. We really need to check ourselves every step of the way. We don't have the answers.
To build humility back into the system, basically.
Absolutely,
Right.
yeah.
Sean, to close.
So I think that like this panel, maybe the greatest indication is time, right? That over a long enough period of time, a lot of our interests do align, and that what we have, a lot of what we do is design outcome-oriented systems now. When we talk about what are the things that we're combating in AI, it's bias or misinformation or things like that, which are characteristic perhaps, but also singular as opposed to systemic. And so I think that, what we see a lot of times is that rather than focus our implementations or our advocacy on single outcomes or specific harms, focusing on agency models that ensure that we will have the ability to continuously push back over time is an incredibly important part of preserving the dynamics that are good for us. And I think that maybe to sort of draft on, there are things that need to turn off sometimes. I think that a lot of what we're doing is essentially building, right now, we are reinstantiating the world as a certain set of systems see it. And I think that what we need to be building or focusing these sort of automations on is amplifying or managing our ability to interact with each other. Like, one of my favorite examples of this is just the term democratization gets used a lot around technology and AI. And more often than not, what it actually means is freedom. We have more power to do more things. But democracy is a system that makes sure that those things are done in the public interest. And we are not necessarily investing in the democratization of technology as much as we are investing in the freedom that it gives us. And I think that that's an important distinction.
I agree. I think this conversation has led me to think that we almost need a separate stage about justice in AI and not just ethics in AI. And please would you thank me, or join me in thanking.
Please thank Johnny!
Thanks, Eddie.
Please thank Johnny!
Well done.
Now that that's, okay, thank you for that, needed that. And maybe also, would you join me in thanking our wonderful panelists? Thank you very much.
Thank you to you.
During the polls.